visit the Knights of Columbus Hall in Fort Kent. This was built in 1969, and it was one of the nicest places in Fort Kent for meetings and social occasions such as weddings. Council 1934 of Fort Kent. The reason we're doing this is that we have pictures of all the Grand Knights and the faithful navigators and the chaplains of the Knights of Columbus in Fort Kent starting in 1919 up to 1957. We're looking now at the inside of the hall. Knights of Columbus was started in Fort Kent in 1919, and in the 1930s, during the Depression, the council almost folded up. Father Giguère, I think, is the one who rescued it by letting Knights of Columbus use the St. Louis Convent as a meeting place. This is the class of 1985. Class of 1986. These are the Knights of Columbus who took their degree in 1986, the Bishop O'Leary class. Class of 1987 was dedicated to Father Richard St. Cyr. These are the names of all those who took their degree that year. This is another one, class of 1989 probably. No, this is the class of 1989. And I can't read to who it was dedicated. This one was dedicated to the Nickner family, Father Leopold, Bernard, and Donald Nickner, 1982. Family from Eagle Lake, who had 3 priests and a nun in their family. This one is dedicated to Pope John Paul II, 1981, class of 1983. Knights of Columbus, this is the emblem of the 3rd degree, and this is the emblem of the 4th degree. The Knights of Columbus have been in Fort Kent now for 70 years. This is a picture of Christopher Columbus and all the names of the officers. The first Grand Knight was Arthur Netto. From 1919 to 1920, he was a lawyer and a judge in Fort Kent. Next one is Irénée, a Grand Knight from 1920 to 1922. He was a postmaster in Fort Kent and a legislator. He died at 102 years old. He helped keep the Fort Kent College in town. Alexandre Doucette, 1924 to 25. He was a salesman for Swift Company of Bangor. Dr. Irénée, 1925 to 26. He was a dentist and the father of Dr. Norman and Morris Cyr, who are dentists in town. Lévite Pelletier, Grand Knight from 1926 to 27 and 32 to 33. He was also a faithful navigator of the 4th degree. Fred Berry, 1924 to 1930. He was a Walgreens drugstore owner in Fort Kent, where Lloyd Parody's building is today on Main Street. Albert Halloran, 1930 to 1932. He was a potato broker. He died in 1957 at the age of 49. Lévite Ouellette, 1933 to 34. He was a potato broker. Romeo Thibodeau was a Grand Knight from 1934 to 37. He was with the Thibodeau Insurance, son of Paul Thibodeau, the founder of Thibodeau's Insurance, and the brother of Omer Thibodeau. Fedzim Caron, 1937 to 43. He owned the store where Dr. Elmer Peltier's office is today. Dr. Léonce Albert, 43 to 46. He is the father of Dr. Rod Albert. He died in 1967. Fred Martin, 1946 to 48. He was a potato inspector. He lived on Doobie Street in Fort Kent. He was also a faithful navigator. Bert Daigle, 1948 to 49. He was a district deputy and a state warden as well. He sold life insurance for Metropolitan. Richard Stewart, 1949 to 50. Moved to Van Buren and he still lives there today. He worked for the BNA. Émile Gaillon, 50 to 51. He was also a faithful navigator, 51 to 52. District deputy in 1970. Albert Sear, 1951 to 52. Superintendent of schools in Fort Kent. He built the high school. He died at the age of 52 in 1957. Denis Lausier, 52 to 55, owner of Lausier's Restaurant, later sold to Claude Thériault, presently Edna and Camille's Restaurant. He was also a financial navigator. Ligier Michaud, 55 to 58, a teacher and principal at Market Street School. This is the first chaplain of the Knights of Columbus in 1919, Father Arthur Descaries. From 1919 to 1925 was Father Raoul Bourbeau. In 1925 to 34, Father Joseph Norman was the chaplain. Father Giguère, 1934 to 51. He's the one who saved the council when it was down to nothing during the Depression and let the KCs use the St. Louis convent for a meeting place. Father Adrien Palardi, 51 to 52. Father Anthony Fortier, 1952 to 55. Father Abel Hébert in 1957. John Pinette was faithful navigator of the 4th degree from 1943 to 46. He was a brakeman for the BNA Railroad. Éluard Daigle, 46 to 47, faithful navigator. He was principal of the schools in Madawaska. Edward Doyle, 47 to 49, faithful navigator, state police sergeant. Paul Michaud, 49 to 51. He was also a state treasurer, 51 to 55. He worked for Savage Men's Store in Fort Kent. Rosaire Tardy, faithful navigator in 1956. Denis Lausier, faithful navigator, district deputy in 1957. Grand Knight Ligier Nadeau in 1957 gives a $100 scholarship to Madawaska Training School to President Joe Fox. The scholarship was given to the child of the KC. Firmin Pelletier and Grand Knight Ligier Nadeau in 1957 collect items for needy children at the Knights Columbus Hall. KCs with Santa Claus and nuns at the St. Louis School in 1957. A parade opening up the Fort Kent Playground Bazaar in 1957 featured a KC float. Christopher was pictured by Bonnie Pelletier, King Ferdinand by Barney Nadeau, Queen Isabella by Joanne Pelletier, who is now Mrs. Ron Parody. 1957, Babe Lozier of Fort Kent was crushed when he was buried in a ditch while working. While recuperating at the People's Benevolent Hospital, Grand Knight Luigi Michaud paid him a visit. Dr. Joe Baresi, optometrist in Fort Kent, was the MC when Governor Muskie visited the council on March 4, 1956. March 16, 1957, Claude Theriault's electrical appliance store burned to the ground. It was located 6 feet from the Casey Hall on Main Street. The Casey Hall is presently the Fort Kent Bottle Center. The burning building was located in Dubois' parking lot of the present. This is the old Casey Hall as it looked in the 1940s. It was purchased from Fred Michaud. It was a store before that. Today it is the Bottle Center. Edward Doyle, Sergeant of the State Police in Fort Kent in the 40s and 50s. In 1957, he was promoted to lieutenant and became commander of the Maine State Police. Governor Muskie, March 4, 1956, with Luigi Michaud, Grand Knight, paying a visit to the Knights of Columbus in Fort Kent. This is a picture of Governor Muskie, 1956, with Postmaster Dr. Joe Baresi. There's a picture again of Governor Muskie with Denny Lozier in the background. Bishop Feeney with the Knights of Columbus and a confirmation held on June 21, 1955 in St. Louis Parish. This is again the same date, the same event. Notice the building in the background on the right. This is where the priest used to live in Fort Kent. Today it is the location of the Daigle and Sons Funeral Home. Here we have the Grand Knight of 1958-1960, Edmund Charette. Edmund was a plumber in Fort Kent. Dr. Joe Baresi, optometrist in Fort Kent, was Grand Knight from 1960 to 1961. Lawrence Roy, Grand Knight from 61 to 63. He was a teacher in Fort Kent. Carol Bouchard, a teacher in Fort Kent, was Grand Knight from 63 to 64. He is now working for the JCs on the international scene. Spent the last 25 years in Europe and Africa. Norman Gee, Grand Knight from 64 to 66. Norman was a potato broker in Fort Kent. Dr. Marc Chasse, chiropractor in Fort Kent, was Grand Knight from 1966 to 1968. Louis Saint-Jean, who died in 1989, was Grand Knight from 68 to 70. The new hall was built during his administration. It opened in 1969. Marc Michaud, Grand Knight 70 to 71. Marc is a teacher in Madawaska and president of the Fort Kent Town Council. Maureen Daigle was Grand Knight from 71 to 73. Maureen works at the hospital in Fort Kent. Roger Harvey from St. Francis was Grand Knight from 73 to 75. Roger now lives in Fort Kent. Leroy Marquis was Grand Knight from 75 to 76. Leroy worked in Fort Kent. He coached several basketball teams in the area. Now works in Boston. Ron Gee is a salesman in Fort Kent, and he was Grand Knight from 76 to 78. He is the son of Norman Gee. Milton Pelletier, who is the manager of the Quigley store, was Grand Knight from 78 to 1980. Fitzim Peltier was Grand Knight from 1980 to 1981. Fitzim has been in the Knights of Columbus for at least 30 years. Clinton Ryu, who works for Daigle Oil, was Grand Knight from 1981 to 1982. Leo Jean Ball was Grand Knight from 1982 to 1984. He is the owner of Forest Hill Manor. Cedric Osgood was Grand Knight from 1984 to 1985. Cedric works for Radio Shack. Dave Taylor, Grand Knight from 85 to 88. Dave works for the Post Office Department in Fort Kent. Lives in Plaisted. Frank Jalbert was Grand Knight from 1988 to 1990. He works at UMFK and lives in Soldier Pond. Pat Plourde is the present Grand Knight since 1990. He's a state policeman and lives in Fort Kent. Father Lionel McCune was the chaplain from 57 to 62. Father Remedy Prue, who was in Fort Kent during 1962 to 64, was our chaplain. He is now bishop in Portland of our diocese. Father Roger Labrec, 64 to 65, was our chaplain. He was with St. Louis Parish. Father Roger Prue, who is now pastor at St. Louis in Upper Frenchville, was our chaplain from 65 to 67. Father Roger Bolduc, 67 to 69. He was assistant pastor in Fort Kent. He died at the age of 42. Father Marcotte, who died last year, was also our chaplain in 1969. Father Marcotte was pastor in St. Louis for many years. Father Claude Albert was our chaplain from 69 to 72. I think Father Albert is now pastor in Presque Isle. Father Maurice Lemelin from Soldier Pond and Wallagrass was our chaplain from 1972 to 1979. Father Norman Richard, an assistant pastor in Fort Kent, was our chaplain from 79 to 1980. Father Mike Doucette, assistant pastor in Fort Kent, was our chaplain from 1980 to 1984. Father Doucette is now in North Caribou, pastor over there. Father Robert Bouchard, who was assistant pastor in Fort Kent, he is a native of Soldier Pond, was our chaplain 84 to 86. Father George Pelletier, 86 to 88. He is now pastor in Portage. Father James Neto, our chaplain from 88 to 89. He was very active in the KCs. Our present chaplain is Father Bill Barter from Soldier Pond, Wallagrass, and Daigle parishes. We'll now go to the faithful navigators over the years. Firmin Pelletier was the faithful navigator of the 4th degree, 57 to 59. Edmund Charette was faithful navigator from 60 to 62 and also from 73 to 77. Robert Roy was faithful navigator from 1962 to 1964. Joe Charette from Fort Kent was faithful navigator 64 to 65. In Fort Kent. Elmer Willett, who used to sell for Metropolitan Insurance, was faithful navigator from 1981 to 1983. Now lives in Soldier Pond. Zenon Degg, a retired farmer in Fort Kent, was faithful navigator from 83 to 86. From 1987 to 1989, the faithful navigator was Milton Pelletier. Don Lozier, who owns a body shop on Market Street, was faithful navigator from 1989 to 1990. Our present faithful navigator from 1990 to 1991 is Dave Taylor. Now we'll take a look at a few of our queens, sweetheart queens over the past. On March 6, 1974, Judy Mador, who was the 1973 queen of the Sweetheart Ball of the Knights of Columbus, crowned Odette Dubois, the 1974 queen. Lee Freeman, president of the 1974 class, looks on. Roberta Marquis, with her husband Phil, was the queen in 1976. Our 1977 queen was Greta Harvey, with class president Dave Taylor, rather. In 1978, Roland Cyr was crowned queen on February 10. In 1975, the queen was Brenda Karen. Our 1988 king and queen were Marc Morneau and Christine Theriault. Marc is now married to Lisa Pelletier, and Christine is married to Daniel Chasse.
will now show you some pictures of the history of the Knights of Columbus in Fort Kent. This is a picture of Financial Secretary Reynold Dubois, May 26, 1972, honoring Irene Cyr, 50-year member. He was 97 years old at the time. Grand Knight Oreen Daigle in 1973 with State Deputy Paul Harper and District Deputy Tony Ezzy from Van Buren. Paul Harper is from Bangor. The 1973 class, Sweetheart Ball. Chair people, Warren Harvey, Norman Sirois, James Boucher, and Raymond Bouchard. 14 new candidates took their degree in 1972, their first degree. They are Gerald Massey, Gary Michaud, Régis Michaud, Ray Dupré, Terry Michaud, Warren Harvey, Lincoln Gendreau, Harold Willett, Roland Taggett, Bob Lozier, Norman Marquis, Dan Mador, and Jean-El Nadeau. On November 11, 1972, we had a Halloween party where 700 children showed up. This was sponsored by the Knights of Columbus, and it was to keep the children out of the streets. 1974 and 75, Ted Sirois, chairman of the benefit dance, and Grand Knight Roger Harvey present a check to Brother Finzim Pelzier and his wife. Elmer Lizotte, Denis Pelletier, Grand Knight Roger Harvey, and Deputy Grand Knight Leroy Marquis with the plaque of the names of the 1974 class. Deputy Grand Knight Leroy Marquis presents 74 scrapbook to District Deputy Marc Michaud. Grand Knight Roger Harvey, 1974, and Treasurer Pat Pelletier present check to Jim Marquis, Chairman of the Aroostook Youth Services, 1974. Grand Knight Roger Harvey presents Casey of the Year Award for 1974 to Berman Bonville. Berman now lives in Frenchville. Casey of the Month Awards for 1974 went to Ron Guy, Fitzim Pelletier, Reynold Dubois, Elmer Lizotte, Mickey Levesque, Berman Bonville, John Daigle, Joel Plord, Lester Gendreau, Rudy Daigle, Roger Harvey, and Roger Roy. May 12, 1974, 30-year memberships were presented to Gil Bouchard, Ernie Charette, Émile Gagnon, Claude Dumont, Denis Picard, and Paul-Émile Rioux. On May 12, 1974, honorary memberships were presented to Ernest Pinette, front left, and Ernie Charette, Camille Labbé, and Donna Michaud. 25-year memberships presented in 1974 to Fred Beaulieu, Léopold Audibert, Adrien Chasse, Hubert Thibodeau, Leonard Pelletier, and Roland Dumont. In 1974, we have John Daigle, a chairman of the Kids Halloween Party where 1,300 children attended. Mrs. Robert Dubois, 1974 Queen, with 1975 class publicity chairman Gary Blatt and class president Milton Pelletier. 1974. Here's Hubert Thibodeau on a kitty cat. And In the background is Maynard Saucier, who donated the snow machine for a raffle. On February 5, 1975, Dr. Franklin Grady addressed 300 KCs and their wives on Ladies' Night. On the 5th of February 1975, Brother Leonard Pelletier from St. Francis was the chef for that Ladies' Night. '75 Sweetheart Ball Committee was Clayton Saucier, Jean Laplante, Stu Smith, Gary Blais, Dan Bouchard, and Jeannot Plourde. Brothers from St. Francis who joined the Knights of Columbus in 1975 were Arnold, Rudy, and Paul Pelletier. Also, these brothers joined the Knights of Columbus. They're pictured here in 1975, Claude, Rino, and Lorenzo Caron. Here we have Orini Bosse from New Canada with his two sons, David and Darrell, who joined the Knights of Columbus. This is the old Casey Hall in Fort Kent. It was bought in 1940 for $2,000 and was the Casey Hall for 30 years. It used to be the Fred Michaud store. The third floor was rented. Father McCune, chaplain in those years with Firmin Pelletier in 1954. Here we have the inside of the Casey Hall. On the first floor, it could sit close to 300 people and was used extensively. We have it from both ends. As you can see, this is towards the main street, the front door in the background. It was a very popular place in Fort Kent. Firmin Pelletier with Denis Lausier in 1955. '56, Denis Lausier, Father McCune, Firmin Pelletier and his wife, and Lige Michaud and his wife Bernice. This is when Governor Muskie visited Fort Kent. Here he is accepting a gift from Grand Knight Lige Michaud. In 1956, the KCs donated gifts to the needy. We have Gerald Saucier in the background with Grand Knight Lige Michaud. A food sale at the KC Hall in Fort Kent. Notice the sign that says beans, food sale here, beans on the left upper window there. This is the 1963 class. Those that can be recognized are Norman Desjardins, Norbert Dubé, Louis Pelletier, Gerald Pelletier, Damien Blanchette, Maurice Rioux, Maureen Dago, Edgar Landry, Douglas Pelletier, who was president of the class, Dr. Marc Chasse, Joël Audibert, who was a teacher in Fort Kent and Madawaska for a long time, Dick Hébert, Bert Collin, and Lincoln Ouellette from St. Francis. This is the Degree Day, 1963. We used to march from the Casey Hall on Main Street to the library at the college, which was then a gym. Notice the different look of our Main Street. On the left is a Tasty Freeze instead of BJ's. We have big trees all over the place. In 1968, Émile Gaillon was honored as Mr. KC by the Fort Kent Council. Here he is presented an award by Grand Knight Dr. Marc Chasse. 1967, past Grand Knight Norman Guy presents gavel to Dr. Marc Chasse, incoming Grand Knight. 1967, Grand Knight Dr. Marc Chasse presents Casey of the Month to Gil Pelletier. 1969, Marc Michaud presents Knight of the Month Award to Nelson Martin. At left is Émile Gagnon, District Deputy. Trustee Grand Knight Marc Chasse presents books on Christian doctrine to high school principal Clifford Burkett. Trustee Émile Gagnon presents $100 check to Father Roger Prue of St. John, 1966. District Deputy Clifford Bouchard from Madawaska looks on. 1966, Grand Knight Norman Guy presents a $150 check to Father Ralph Corbeil of Dagle. Secretary Wilfred Boulet looks on. 1976, Susie's Economat presented a Craftmatic floor polisher to the Fort Kent KCs. Store manager Gus Govac makes presentation to custodian Edgar Pelletier. In 1963, these were the officers of the Knights of Columbus: Barney Neto, Deputy Grand Knight; Father Amédée Prue, Chaplain; Carol Bouchard, Grand Knight; back row, Wilfred Boulet, Trustee; Émile Gagnon, Trustee; Lou Morneau, Outside Guard; E.J. Michaud, Treasurer; Lou Rioux, Warden; Edgar Levac, Financial Secretary; Dr. Marc Chasse, Secretary; Fidzim Pelletier, Inside Guard; Lawrence Audebert, Chancellor; Émile Gagnon cutting the 50th anniversary cake of the Fort Kent Knights Columbus, 1969. 1971, a breakfast and bingo for the kids at the KC Hall. Denis Picard and Orrin Daigle are pictured. 1969, Pitt Voisin receives Knight of the Year Award from Grand Knight Marc Chasse. 1969 again, KC's preparing a degree are Ken Parody, Marcel Lan, Marc Chasse, and Orrin Daigle. 1972, District Deputy Émile Gagnon presents plaque to Dr. Marc Chasse and past Grand Knight Louis Saint-Jean. District Deputy Émile Gagnon, 1972. Knight of the Month Award is presented to Ken Parody. 1969, the KCs donate $500 to Vocation Fund of St. Louis Parish. Grand Knight Marc Chasse is pictured with Father Marcotte and District Deputy Émile Gagnon. Knight of the Year Award 1970 was Dr. Marc Chasse, presented award on December 18, 1970 by Grand Knight Louis Saint-Jean and District Deputy Émile Gagnon. 1973, John McDevitt class plaque was reviewed by Grand Knight Orrin Daigle, State Deputy Paul Harper of Bangor, and District Deputy Tony Ezzy of Van Buren. March 1967, Grand Knight Dr. Marc Chasse presents $500 for Vocation Fund to Father Wilfred Soucy of St. Louis Parish. A golf tournament in 1974 was won by the following people: Father Julien Rondeau of Van Buren, Marc Chasse, Fort Kent; Joël Sirouet of Madawaska, Pat Pelletier, Fort Kent; Don Arnold, Madawaska; Omer Picard. 1969, Irvin Ouellet accepts Casey of the Month from Maurice Rioux, while Marc Chasse looks on. Dignitaries visiting Fort Kent in 1969 with State Deputy from Portland, District Deputy from Fort Fairfield, along with Émile Gagnon and Marc Chasse here. Grand Knight Leroy Marquis gives the incoming Grand Knight gavel to Ron Guy in 1976. Leroy Marquis conducts a meeting in 1976. He was a Grand Knight up to that point. Berman Bonville, a reporter for the Bangor Daily News. It's pictured here. He was very active in the Knights of Columbus. He was a district deputy for a while. Now lives in Frenchville. Star Council Award in 1976 is presented to Grand Knight Leroy Marquis by past Grand Knight Roger Harvey. 1976, Willard Jalbert class officers with 43 candidates were George Caron, Lester Bouchard, Edmund Pelletier, Norman Bouchard, Bert Michaud, Ron Dago, and Clifford Pelletier. Gerald Pelletier and his three sons joined the Knights of Columbus in 1976. Speaker at the annual Ladies' Night, 1976, Father Maurice Lemlin, our chaplain. Also a speaker that evening was Jim Hoyt, who was known as Mr. Fort Kent. Died 5 years ago at the age of 86. Another speaker for that evening was a very active Knights of Columbus and trustee, Hubert Thibodeau. Maine's Junior Miss 1976 was from Fort Kent. She is Carol Marquis, the daughter of Edgar Marquis. She was presented a flag by Grand Knight Leroy Marquis on March 10, 1976. Here she is giving a speech on that date. She is also the sister of Brother Bob Marquis. These are father and sons, Bert Raymond and his son, Norman, Danny, Eldon, and Rudy. Fourth degree, 1976 commemorative service is led by Roy Lozier. Reginald Gendreau and Roy Lozier at the commemorative service. Ron Guy and Leroy Marquis, honoring our departed brothers, 1976. Here we have a picture of Pidvoisin as he presents his showcase that he built for us, the Grand Knight Leroy Marquis. Summer Picnic, 1976. Roger Harvey, Lester Gendreau, and Denis Picard are helping out. 1976-77 officers, Financial Secretary Phil Roy, Chaplain Father Lemlin, Grand Knight Ron Guy, Treasurer Jim Dubé, Secretary Paul Collins, and Chancellor Milton Voisin. Night of the Year, Berman Bonville, presenting an award from Ron Guy, Grand Knight, 1976. Edgar Pelletier won the grand prize in 1976 at the raffle that we had. The grand prize was a gun. Special awards in 1976 went to Leroy Marquis Grand Knight, Patébert for Beano, and dance chairman Roger Roy. VIP awards went to Warren Harvey, Jeannot Plourde, Robert Martin, Milton Pelletier, David Charette, and Joel Plourde. These are people who did a lot of work for the Knights of Columbus in 1976. 30-year memberships were awarded in 1976 to Alban Bouchard, Cliff Audebert, Albini Nadeau, and Hubert Thibodeau. 1976, Ernest Pinette and Edgar Boucher were given their honorary life membership. This is the Grand Night Ronagee for the year 1976 to 1977. At a senior citizens dance in 1976, Mr. and Mrs. Leodore Albert of Clare, New Brunswick, attended our dance. 1976, we have Jim Markey and Ronnie Gee were tournament directors for the Knights of Columbus foul shooting contest held in Fort Kent. Kevin Chasse, Carl Pelletier, Carl Chasse, Danny Chasse, Tammy Landine, Terry Landine, Kim Waddell, and Elaine Labby were the winners. Class officers of Bishop Amédée Proux, class 1977, were Reynold Voisin, Dave Taylor, president, Alan Dumont, B. Pelletier, Dick Ouellette, Dean Plourde, and Guilford Gaillon. Jim Connors gave us a nice poetry talk in 1977 at the Ladies' Night. Dr. Royal Goheen, guest speaker at 1977, receives gift from the Knights of Columbus. 11-year-old Kevin Chasse was state champion of the foul shooting contest, presenting an award from Ronnie Gee. Pat Hebert was the Knight Columbus of the Year in Fort Kent, 1977. Father Lemlin is giving an award for service rendered to the Knights of Columbus. Roger Roy is given an award for being president of the corporation for 5 years in 1977. 1988, candidates Curtis Saucier and Mike Sylvain selling tickets to the Sweetheart Ball. Here's candidate Curtis Saucier, chairman of the Sweetheart Ball, 1988. Candidate Morris Hebert and Glenn Caron selling Pepsi in the kitchen. Candidate Chad Dipre and his date at the Sweetheart Ball, 1988. President of the class, Marc Morneau, with Clifford Audebert and Christine Theriault at the Sweetheart Ball, 1988. Candidate Mike Sylvain, selling tickets at the door. He looks like he's bored a little bit. Candidate Morris Hebert, with cross he made for the new prayer room. Here's a candidate selling raffle tickets in front of Brooks, 1988. The Pelletier family with Wild Game Supper. Carol, great-grandfather Leonard Pelletier, Derek Pelletier and his dad Tom, and grandfather Gary Pelletier. State Secretary Donald Madden takes over podium from Grand Knight Dave Taylor at the 1988 banquet. Father George Pelletier, our chaplain, does his best at cooking bread for the banquet. Brother Jim Corriveau receiving door prize at the Wild Game Supper in 1988. The 1988 class bought a color TV for our council. President Marc Morneau gives it to the Grand Knight Dave Taylor. Candidate Glenn Caron made the new plaque for the officers, and he is pictured here with Grand Knight Dave Taylor. This is what you see as you come into the Knights of Columbus Council. The Degree Morning Breakfast was chaired by Phil Sear. Paul Marquis and the Boy Scouts put up a cross in front of the Catholic School of Religion in 1988 on Pleasant Street. Brother Cedric. Mrs. Edeltraut Thiele accepts a $441 gift from Tootsie-Roll Chairman Cedric Osgood on behalf of the handicapped. 1987, Father Richard St. Cyr was pastor of St. Louis Parish. The class was named in his honor. Here's the Grand Night from 1987. Dave Taylor. Our district deputy in 1987 was Gary Pelletier. President of the class was Dan DeVoe, who is the manager of the Verdiers. The class captain was Paul Marquis. Here's President DeVoe with his vice president, Jeff Pelletier. Class officers, 1987, were David Blier, Jeff Pelletier, Dan Levasseur, Dan DeVoe, Craig Daigle, and Paul Lozier. Monday Night Bingo. Here we have Jim Corriveau, chairman, with Don Lozier, who is the announcer. Here are some guys fooling around at the Sweetheart Ball, Darwin Tanguy and Dana Pelletier. Who's the queen in the bunch there? Brothers Paul Lozier and Bruce Corriveau are tired after decorating the hall. Brothers Dave Blier and Dan Levasseur posing for the camera. Runners-up at the Sweetheart Ball 1987 were Don and Diane DeVoe, Don and Linda Byron, Dan Levasseur and Lisa Roy. Brother Gerald Atchison gets way up to clean the hall after the dance. Brother Dan Levasseur doesn't seem to know what a goat looks like. 9/8/88, the officers of the council were installed by District Deputy Gary Pelletier. He is with Grand Knight Pat Plord, Gary Smart, Financial Secretary, Don Lozier, here he is with Paul Marquis. This is September 1988. Here he is with Jim Corriveau. Again, Gary is congratulating Leo Jambard. Here he is with Milton Pelletier. Class President Mark Morneau. Here is Dave Taylor and Zenon Degg and Clinton Ryu being congratulated by District Deputy Gary Pelletier. October 13, 1988, Paul Marquis, chairman of the Child Abuse Program, accepts donations from faithful navigator Milton Pelletier and Grand Knight Dave Taylor. Honor Guard of the 1988 commemorative service. Wild Game Supper on March 10, 1989 with Gary Pelletier. The menu was moose, togue, salmon, and trout. Ray Saucier helps in the cooking. 1989, Frank Jalbert presents $100 donation to Father Ritter's Home for Runaway Teenagers. Grand Knight Frank Jalbert presents Father Bill Barter money for a printing machine. Chris Lozier, 1989, accepts a donation of $100 to help in his soccer trip to Europe. This is our bowling team in 1989 who represented us in Bangor. Leo Jambard, Phil Robichaud, Leo Boulet. Here they are again in Bangor 1989, our bowling team. These were the council officers of the 4th degree in 1989. An exemplification of the 4th degree was held in August of 1988. Ray Saucier carries the flag. Brother Gerald Plord is seen at Father Marquis' 80th anniversary celebration in 1989. Pat Pelletier helps in the kitchen at Father Marquis' birthday party 1989. Brother Paul Marquis and Jim Curryvaux help with the 4th degree breakfast on April 30, 1989. Financial navigator Milton Pelletier and Grand Knight Dave Taylor present donation to Sue Deschaines for Recreation Department. 4th degree recognition night, 500 prize money was won by Gary Smart. B. Pelletier enjoys the food at the 4th degree recognition night, April 2, 1989. The Columbiettes sang Christmas carols at the Frenchville Nursing Home in 1988. They also presented a $250 scholarship to Kevin Dubois. Vice President Jean Belanger and President Cécile Voisin are pictured. 3 past presidents of the Columbiettes of 1988, Nadine Landry, Greta Harvey, and Nancy Daigle. In 1990, we held the youth ministry in Fort Kent. Knights of Columbus were very mixed up in it. Here they are getting ready in the school cafeteria to receive all the youngsters. Here we have Frank Jalbert getting ready. Here's captain of the class, 1990, Lou Morneau, helping out. Candidate Pat LeClaire helping out with the coffee during the youth ministry. Grand Knight Frank Jalbert hard at work, brossing 55 gallons of spaghetti sauce. Here's Brother Zeno Daigle and Frank Jalbert doing their duty in the kitchen. This is the crew that fed the 600 kids who attended the youth ministry in Fort Kent in the spring of 1990. Chef Gary Pelletier and Lester Gendreau labored hard in the kitchen all day. Steve Daigle and Steve Dumont enjoyed the meal at the Casey Hall in the month of March 1990. Some of the kitchen help: Pat Plord, Tom Pelletier, and Lester Gendreau. Marco Morneau looks tired, selling tickets at the Sweetheart Ball 1990. Here are the candidates of the class of 1990. Paul Ouellette, Carl Chasse, Reno Cyr, Steve Morneau, Pat LeClaire, Galen Boucher, Larry Caron, Alan Daigle, Jim Daigle, Pete Daigle, Tim Daigle, Kerry Guile, Troy Gardner, Rick Jarvet, Bruce Hebert, Mike Hebert, Carl Kelly, Keith Kelly, Gilles Levesque, Marco Morneau, Keith Parody, Bob Pelletier, Jason Pelletier, Peter Raymond, Steve Thibodeau, and Bruce Theriault. This is Bishop Garrity in 1969 during our centennial year. In 1969, the Knights of Columbus had a float in the Centennial Parade. 1950, at the 4th degree, we have here Fred Martin, Grigory Robichaud, Paul-Émile Michaud, Claude Dumont, Denis Lausier, Émile Gaillon, and Pat Dumont. 1950. Here's the 4th degree honor guard at a confirmation in Wallagrass. Trèfle Gendreau, Pat Dumont, Claude Dumont, Denis Lausier, Paul Bouchard, and Tudule Saucier. These are 4th degrees of our council. Jim and George Dumont's confirmation in 1959 with their father, Claude Dumont, in Wallagrass. At a 4th degree in 1950 in Van Buren, this group from Daigle included front row Mr. and Mrs. Georges-Émile Pelletier, Mr. and Mrs. Bert Raymond, back row Mr. and Mrs. George Charette, Mr. and Mrs. Silvio Daigle, Mr. and Mrs. Lizim Pelletier. Here in 1988, Claude Dumont and Annette with Lloyd Dumont and Luella at the 4th degree. This is a class of 1947 in front of the Casey Hall in Fort Kent. First row we have Pat Daigle, Lou Daigle, Bernard Labbé, Kermit Staudet, Julien Castonguay, Armand Levasseur, Aurine Gaillon, Léo Paradis, Lionel Babin, Val Nadeau, Rodolphe Lang, Harold Pinette. Second row, Guy Nadeau, Albert Dubois, Roland Lang, Jérôme Voisine, Alcide Caron, Théophile Landry, Joe Marquis, Antonio Chasse, Blackie Bellan, Delcé Laferrière, Willie Roy. Back row we have Paul Pelletier, Bernard Michaud, Bill Babin, Bellon Pelletier, Claude Lang, Hilaire Hébert, Robert Guy, Cyril Pelletier, Bert Landry, Norman Dagg, Pat Morin, and Pitt Levasseur. Fourth degree, Gerald Saucier and his wife in 1954. Again at the fourth degree, Leonid Saucier and his wife, and Gerald and his wife, 1954. Madame Philomène Gendreau in 1966 with her 4 sons in the fourth degree, Reginald, Roland, Delcé, and Robert. 1991 candidate Robert Lavoie with his father of Saint-Jean-de-la-Lande, who joined the KCs in 1967. Pat Dubois and his wife had his fourth degree in 1972 in Norwalk, Connecticut. Grand Knight Frank Jalbert in 1959 at a state convention receives the Outstanding Council Award for our council. Father Alphée Marquis, Casey of the Year 1989 with Frank Jalbert and Father Jim Nadeau. Grand Knight presents Dr. and Mrs. Richard Raymond Family of the Year Award 1989. Columbiette President Cécile Voisine receives award from Grand Knight Frank Jalbert 1989. Father Jim Nadeau and Jim Curry will take a break from the picnic 1989 to discuss Father Jim's leaving. Louellette receives a lifetime membership award in fourth degree. Milton Pelletier receives award from faithful navigator Don Lozier. Bingo at Halloween 1989. Here's Jim Corriveau. That's how he dressed up. Look at Phil Voisine. That must have been some bingo. The Columbiettes paid for the arch at the entrance of St. Louis Cemetery. It was made by Roland Saint-Jean, Léo Jean-Ball, Zonandeg, and Pitt Voisine. Here's Columbiettes at the Christmas party at the nursing home, dancing with Santa Claus. The goat of the third degree, 1989. She says, "Don't be cruel." Officers of 1986 Bishop O'Leary class, Ralph Caron, Ricky Pelletier, Jerry Ouellette, Dave Dupré. Mr. and Mrs. Hector Daigle won a 300-pound beef raffle, 1986. Captain of the class, 1986, was Carol Caron. He's shown here with Dean Plord. 1986 Queen and King were Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Caron. 1986, the runner-ups were Kathy Daigle and Tom Audibert. They were the first runner-ups. And the second runner-ups were Kim Caron and John Daigle, 1986. Brother Reno Sylvain accepts an award from Grand Knight Dave Taylor in 1986. Mr. and Mrs. Terry Plord, who gave a lot of services to the Knights of Columbus, accept an award from Grand Knight Dave Taylor. Officers for 1983-84. Trustee Phil Voisine, Deputy Grand Knight Dave Taylor, Grand Knight Léo Jean-Ball, Chancellor Mark Plord, Financial Secretary Phil Voisine, Outside Guard Roy Thompson, Warden Rodney Furlong, Recording Secretary Osgood. Father Mike Doucette gives blood at the annual blood drive of the KCs in 1984. Léon Collin sells Tootsie Rolls. Léo Collin sells Tootsie Rolls in 1984 in front of Susie's Economat. Casey of the Year for 1983, Bert Michaud and his wife. Grand Knight Aurine Daigle recognizes volunteer firemen from Eagle Lake, Everett Perot, Phil Bouchard from Fort Kent, and Fernando Harvey from St. Francis. John Daigle, chairman of the annual Halloween party. Officers for 1973 were Ron Guy, Chancellor, Leonard Pelletier, Trustee, Oreen Daigle, Past Grand Knight, Roger Harvey, Grand Knight, Tom St. Louis, State Deputy, Tony Ezzy, District Deputy, Father Marc Chaplain, Fitzim Pelletier, Warden, Aimé Côté and Ron Thibault, Guards, Mickey Lévesque, Recorder, Joël Ploub, Membership Chairman, Lester Gendreau, Program Chairman, Camille Labbé, Trustee, Pat Pelletier, Treasurer, and Claude Pelletier, Trustee. Judge Artonetto gives a speech on sentencing of criminals in 1974 to our council. Lawyer Robert Jalbert gave a lecture on wills in 1974. He's pictured with Grand Knight Roger Harvey and Chaplain Father Limley. Congressman Bill Gowen visited our council in 1984. He's pictured with Town Manager Claude Dumont and Grand Knight Roger Harvey. 1978, past Grand Knight Ron Guy presents gavel to Milton Pelletier, incoming Grand Knight. Father Norman Thibodeau, a Fort Kent native, working now on the Indian reservations in New Brunswick, greets Archbishop Jean Jadot from Rome. On June 1, 1977, the Fort Kent Council held a ping-pong tournament. The winners were Louise Thériault, Hilda Pelletier, Kevin Chasse, Connie Voisin, and Pat Ross. In 1978, class officers were Franklin Thériault, Secretary, Léo Collin, President, Raoul Voisin, Vice President, Ron Parody, Recorder, and Dave Dumont, Treasurer. The visit in 1978 of State Deputy George Sear of Bangor and District Deputy Bert Sear of Madawaska. Columbiates are organized in 1979. Officers are Linda Nadeau, Treasurer, Rita Hubert, Vice President, Rita Harvey, President, Diane Collin, Secretary, B. Daigle, Treasurer, Rose Belanger, Guard, Juanita Thériault, Trustee, Germaine Soucy, Trustee, Gail Sirouette, Trustee, Juliette Pelletier, Secretary, Dean Morin, Guard. A large cross was erected in front of the Casey Hall in 1981, constructed by Lou Morneau and sculpted by George Roy. Past Grand Knight Milton Pelletier, Grand Knight Fitzim Pelletier, and Father Nickner are pictured in front of the cross. Léon Voisin and his 6 sons are members of the KCs in 1979. They are Alan, Léon Jr., Phil, Gary, Tony, and Tom. This is in 1979. In 1949, we had a parade in Fort Kent. The KC float depicted Christopher Columbus. Playing the part of Christopher Columbus was Barney Netto of Fort Kent. Here are the honor guard on that float. The class of 1967, Louis Gagnon, Irvin Ouellette, Dick Fournier, Father Chouinard, Marc Michaud, Bob Johnson, Ross Parody, George Carpenter, Ray Coulombe, Henry Rioux, Don Martin, Dick Pelletier, Maurice Pelletier, Roger Bonenfant, Jérôme Marquis, and Phil Roy. This is the class of 1967. Many of them are still active in our council. Some of them were from out of town, such as Johnson here and Ross Parody were from Madawaska. Father Chouinard also was the assistant pastor in Madawaska. This is a 1991 class, Desert Heroes class officers. Chuck Dow, taking care of points, Robert Caron, 3rd Vice President, Dr. Dan Chasse, Secretary, Norman Albert, President, Mike Davenport, 1st Vice, Phil Guy, 2nd Vice, and Tim Daigle, Treasurer. These are the guards of the class, 1991, André Cyr and Dan Duby. President Norman with his 3 Vice Presidents, Mike Davenport, Phil Guy, and Robert Caron. This is a picture of candidate Gil Netto with his father Alderic of Clare, been member of Council 3764 since 1983. This is Dick Morin and his son, Dale, who is a candidate in our class. Alton Bernier, candidate in our class with his brother Clinton, who joined in 1989. Candidate Marc Levesque with his two sons, Gilles, who joined in 1990, and Yves in 84. Candidates Robert, Norman, Karen in front with brothers Carl, Reno, and Larry Karen, all members of the Knights of Columbus in Fort Kent. These are all brothers. Candidate David Chasse with his father Gerard, who joined in 1977. Candidate Dr. Dan Chasse with his father Dr. Marc Chasse, who joined in 1963. Candidate Kerry Lagasse with his father Reno Lagasse, who joined the Knights of Columbus in 1972. Candidate Jim Bouchard with his father Wallace, who joined the Knights in 1982. Candidate Tim Daigle with his father John Daigle, who joined the Knights of Columbus in 1972. Our 1991 Queen, Lena Michaud, with her husband, candidate Roy Michaud. Dr. and Mrs. Dan Chasse at the Sweetheart Ball. Mrs. Chasse was the Queen in 1988. Mrs. Priscilla Chasse, winner of the Door Prize at the Sweetheart Ball, a radio donated by Netto's House of Furniture. Roland Levesque and his wife enjoying the Sweetheart Ball. He is a candidate. Bert and Kathy Roy and Vicky and Bert Bouchard, Bert Boucher at the Sweetheart Ball, having a good time. Mr. and Mrs. Arms Lavey, Dr. and Mrs. Marc Chasse, and Mr. and Mrs. Gerard Plord enjoying the dance. Candidate Gilman Netto and his wife trying to make some points at the Sweetheart Ball. On February 3, the candidates took snow off the KC Hall roof. Brother candidate Robert Levoire working hard inside the hall. Candidate Marc Gagnon waxing the walls inside the hall. Candidate Jim Bouchard and Phil Guy working in the hall. Some friends here just hanging around. Wallace Bouchard and his son Jim and Bun Terio having a good time. 1991 class prepared the February supper for the council. Norman Karen, Marc Levesque, André Cyr, Tim Daigle, and Robert Lavoie.